In the autumn of 2022, the night before the most controversial World Cup in football history kicked off in Qatar, a man in an expensive suit stood behind a podium in Doha and delivered what journalists would immediately call one of the most bizarre speeches ever given by a major sports official. A nearly hour-long stream of consciousness monologue in which he declared that he felt gay, that he felt disabled, that he felt like a migrant worker, and that because he once had red hair and an Italian accent at a Swiss school, he understood the suffering of the very workers whose deaths had been reported in the stadiums behind him. Workers who had traveled from Bangladesh and Nepal and India to build the infrastructure of football's grandest tournament, and who, by various credible estimates, had died in the thousands during construction. And the man delivering this speech, Gianni Infantino, president of FIFA, the governing body of the world's most popular sport, was not embarrassed by a single word of it, because Gianni Infantino is never embarrassed, and that is not a flaw in his character but the very foundation of his power. And to understand how one relatively obscure Swiss-Italian bureaucrat turned the most catastrophic institutional scandal in the history of sport into a personal empire worth billions of dollars and spanning every continent on Earth, you have to understand that everything about Infantino that looks like a mistake is actually a message, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The story begins not with Infantino, but with the collapse that made him possible, because power of this kind does not emerge from healthy institutions. It emerges from ruins, and FIFA in 2015 was spectacular ruins. For decades, football's governing body had been an open secret in the world of international sports corruption, a place where votes were bought, contracts were rigged, and executives enriched themselves on the backs of the sport's billions of devoted followers across every continent, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where football was not merely entertainment, but identity, religion, the organizing principle of entire communities. The FBI and the Department of Justice had been building their case for years, and when it broke in May of 2015, it broke like a dam. 14 officials arrested at a luxury hotel in Zurich, charges of racketeering and bribery and wire fraud and money laundering, a sitting FIFA president who would resign in disgrace within a week of winning his own re-election, $360 million in sponsor money fleeing the organization almost overnight, and the entire global football public confronting the fact that the body entrusted with stewarding their sport had been functioning as something closer to an organized crime syndicate with a logo. The word FIFA became, as journalist Adam Crafton of The Athletic has noted, essentially synonymous with corruption, a punchline, a byword, a symbol of everything that was wrong with international sports governance. And when FIFA's 209 member associations gathered in early 2016 to elect a new president, they faced a genuine reckoning. They needed someone who could credibly promise a clean break, someone untainted by the previous regime, someone who could lure the sponsors back and restore something resembling legitimacy to an organization that had none. What they got was Gianni Infantino, and the choice seemed, on its surface, almost comically modest. Here was a man who had spent his career as a legal administrator and then a communications director for UEFA, the European Football Confederation, whose most visible public role had been standing on stage during the UEFA Champions League draw, shuffling balls around in bowls, making small talk, filling time, charming in a slightly awkward way, technically competent, utterly unthreatening. He was not one of the big-name candidates. He was not the head of the Asian Confederation or a former FIFA vice president or someone with years of geopolitical credibility. He was, as Crafton put it, a bit of a technocrat kind of figure, and that was precisely why the moment belonged to him. FIFA did not need a visionary. It needed a face that did not remind anyone of what had just happened. And Infantino's face had never appeared on any indictment. He was the human equivalent of a fresh coat of paint on a building with serious structural damage, and in the short term, that was exactly what the institution needed and exactly what he provided. The early Infantino was, by any measure, an impressive performer of reform. He took budget airlines on his first official trips. He announced limits on presidential terms. He pushed for the public disclosure of executive salaries. He talked constantly, in that warm, earnest, slightly over-eager way of his, about listening to the fans, listening to the players, listening to football. And crucially, he delivered results that the organization's 209 member associations could feel in their bank accounts. The 2018 World Cup in Russia generated $4.6 billion for FIFA, a record at the time, and Infantino used that money with surgical precision, distributing an extra $5 million to every single member association, a gesture that meant something very different depending on where you were in the world. For the wealthy federations of Western Europe and North America, it was a nice bonus. For the federations of Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, the smaller nations of Central America, and the Caribbean, it was transformative. It meant new training facilities, renovated pitches, youth development programs, expanded women's football infrastructure, the material difference between a national federation that functioned and one that barely existed. Gianni Infantino was not merely buying votes, though he was absolutely buying votes. He was also, in a real and measurable sense, improving football in parts of the world that European and American journalists rarely covered, and the people who ran those federations knew it, and they were grateful. And gratitude in the one-member, one-vote world of FIFA is the most valuable currency of all. This is the mechanism that the mainstream coverage of Infantino consistently fails to fully explain, and it matters enormously for understanding how he operates. FIFA's voting structure is deliberately equalizing. The Federation of the Faroe Islands has the same vote as the Federation of Brazil. This means that the path to sustained power at FIFA does not run through Paris or London or New York. It runs through Dar es Salaam and Phnom Penh and Port Moresby and Suva, through the dozens of smaller federations that have historically felt ignored and condescended to by European football's establishment, and Infantino understood this with a clarity that his predecessors had exploited criminally and that he would exploit politically. Every tournament expansion he championed, the Women's World Cup from 24 to 32 teams, the Club World Cup from 7 to 32 clubs, the Men's World Cup from 32 to the unprecedented 48 teams beginning in 2026, was simultaneously a revenue decision, a sporting decision, and a loyalty decision. Because more teams meant more nations participating, more nations receiving qualification revenue, more federations with a direct financial stake in Infantino's continued presidency, more votes locked up before the election even began. He was not just running FIFA. He was engineering a political coalition on a global scale, and he was doing it with the resources of the world's most popular sport. Once that coalition was firmly in place, the reforms began to quietly disappear. The ethics committee that was supposed to investigate wrongdoing within FIFA was restructured, and its most aggressive officials were pushed out. The term limits that Infantino had championed were extended to accommodate his own continued ambitions, and then extended again, and as of his most recent announcement, he is running for a fourth term with no credible opponent on the horizon. The transparent, consultative decision-making process that had been promised after 2015 gave way to something that insiders and journalists describe as almost entirely centralized around one man, a point made most starkly in the case of the expanded Club World Cup, which appeared seemingly fully formed without any clear explanation of who had asked for it, what process had generated it, or how the substantial revenues had been allocated. FIFA under Infantino had become, in the words of those who cover it closely, a very one-man show. And that man had stopped behaving like a humble servant of the sport and started behaving like its proprietor. The autocratic tendencies were matched by an increasingly aggressive cultivation of relationships with the world's most powerful and most controversial governments. And this is where Infantino's strategy becomes genuinely difficult to assess because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, working closely with host governments is simply a logistical necessity. You need security cooperation, visa arrangements, infrastructure guarantees, and a functioning relationship with whoever controls the territory where your tournament is being held. On another level, the nature and intensity of Infantino's government relationships has consistently gone far beyond what operational necessity would require. His appearances with Vladimir Putin in the lead-up to 2018, the laughing, the ball-kicking, the effusive mutual praise while Russian troops were operating in eastern Ukraine, attracted criticism that Infantino deflected by noting the obvious truth that he had to work with the host. His decision to relocate to Doha during the lead-up to Qatar 2022 to use Qatari royal family private jets to give that extraordinary speech deflecting blame for migrant worker deaths onto the critics raising them rather than the employers responsible for them. These were choices that went well beyond operational necessity and into something that looked considerably more like political alignment, or perhaps like the performance of political alignment as a way of signaling to the global South that Infantino was their man against the moralizing West. The "I feel like a migrant worker" speech is worth pausing on because it is the most perfect crystallization of the Infantino method. On the surface, it was absurd. A wealthy Swiss administrator comparing his experience of childhood bullying to the experience of men who had died of heat stroke building football stadiums in 45-degree heat. And much of the Western media treated it as an unhinged gaffe, a PR catastrophe, evidence that Infantino had simply lost the plot. But the speech was not aimed at the Western media. It was aimed at the leaders assembled in that room from across the Arab world and the global South. And for that audience, it landed very differently, as a defiant rejection of European and American presumption, as a declaration that FIFA under Infantino would not allow the wealthy world to use human rights discourse as a cudgel to undermine their moment, their tournament, their place in football's story. Whether or not you find that argument compelling, and there are serious people who find it at least partially compelling alongside serious people who find it morally reprehensible, the point is that Infantino knew exactly what he was doing. He is, as those who cover him consistently note, extremely good at saying different things to different audiences and extremely unbothered by the inconsistencies between those things when they are placed side by side. The full flowering of this strategy is the 2026 World Cup, which is the biggest, the most lucrative, the most geographically sprawling, and the most politically complicated tournament in the history of the sport. 48 teams, 3 host nations, games across 16 cities from Vancouver to Guadalajara to Boston to Los Angeles, projected revenues of somewhere in the region of $11 billion. And at the center of it all, Gianni Infantino and his extraordinarily intense relationship with the government of the host nation most capable of making or breaking the entire enterprise, the United States of America under Donald Trump. The courtship of Trump by Infantino is one of the stranger diplomatic subplots of recent years. It began during Trump's first term with fawning public praise. Infantino once suggested that Trump was made of the same fiber as the world's greatest athletes, and it accelerated dramatically after Trump's 2024 re-election, with Infantino appearing at Mar-a-Lago at the inauguration at a Middle East peace summit that had nothing to do with football, at the White House by what journalists best count is at least 5 times in a single year, and most infamously, inventing from apparently nothing a brand new award, the FIFA Peace Prize, and bestowing it upon the sitting American president, a decision that, according to reporting by The Athletic, appears to have been made by one man with no consultation of FIFA's broader governance structure. The Trump relationship is where Infantino's strategy runs into its most serious complications, because Trump is a variable that cannot be fully controlled. Every time Infantino tried to use their joint appearances to advance FIFA's operational agenda, most crucially, a visa program that would allow World Cup ticket holders from countries with otherwise restrictive entry requirements to attend games in the United States, Trump redirected the conversation toward his own priorities, at one point veering into a lengthy discussion of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua in the middle of what was supposed to be a football announcement, and at another point raising the issue of transgender athletes at a football event in a way that left Infantino visibly searching for somewhere to look. Trump also publicly called Infantino a piece of work for refusing to expel Iran from the tournament, a significant piece of public friction between two men who were supposed to be projecting alignment. And the ICE raised question whether the United States federal government would suspend enforcement operations in host cities during the tournament, a matter of enormous practical importance for organizing an event in cities with large immigrant communities, remained unresolved as of spring 2025, with city governments beginning to opt out of FIFA events and others picking public fights over the costs of hosting, none of which is the kind of smooth operational backdrop that a well-run tournament requires. What Infantino has built over his decade at FIFA's helm is genuinely impressive by the metrics he has chosen to prioritize. He took an organization that had lost $360 million in sponsor revenue and was genuinely in danger of institutional collapse and turned it into a machine generating billions per cycle. He expanded football's global footprint in ways that have materially benefited smaller federations and genuinely developed the women's game. He has proven himself one of the most effective political operators in the history of international sports governance, a man capable of maintaining coalitions across wildly divergent governments and cultures by the sheer force of his shamelessness and his willingness to say whatever the person in front of him most wants to hear. But the question of whether he has improved FIFA, whether the institution is more ethical, more transparent, more genuinely accountable to the sport and its billions of followers than it was before the 2015 scandal, that question has a much more uncomfortable answer, because the evidence suggests that what Infantino has actually built is a more financially robust and more politically consolidated version of exactly the same kind of one-man, loyalty-based, reform-averse institution that the scandal of 2015 was supposed to permanently dismantle. He didn't fix FIFA's corruption. He just made the corruption profitable enough that nobody powerful enough to stop it has any incentive to try. And yet, here is the thing that Infantino knows perhaps better than anyone alive. The scandal always fades when the football starts. Every World Cup of the modern era has been preceded by months of justified outrage. The human rights abuses, the displacement, the corruption, the cronyism, the astronomical costs borne by ordinary citizens while FIFA's accounts fill. And then the first ball drops, the first goal goes in, the first underdog beats a giant, and hundreds of millions of people around the world remember why they fell in love with this sport in the first place, and the headlines shift from the FIFA president's latest speech to the magic of the tournament itself. Infantino is counting on it happening again in 2026, and given the extraordinary football that 48 competing nations will produce across the cities of North America, he is almost certainly right. After 2026 comes the 2030 World Cup across 6 countries and 3 continents. After that, the 2031 Women's World Cup in 4 countries with 48 teams for the first time. After that, the 2034 tournament awarded to Saudi Arabia in circumstances that critics described as a procedural manipulation, cementing Infantino's relationship with one of his most powerful and most controversial allies. He is already running for a 4th term. The empire is not finished. It is, by every measure its architect would recognize, just getting started.